everyone for coming. It's great to see so many. It's great to see the members of the great British public here. You're more than welcome, and we hope you come to these all the time. They're every Monday. So she's been associated with us for some time. She is, obviously, having had that role, she's a very distinguished journalist. In fact, in all areas, broadcasts, print, online, Tessa has made her presence felt. She's also written books. A lot of her work has been in the field of investigations. We were talking today, and there are very few women in investigative posts in the mainstream media. It's interesting to ponder why. Well, Tessa has made her name on quite a number of very important investigative programmes, Sky Television, ITV. You actually had your own series, didn't you, for a while? She's also written a lot in the area of privacy and celebrity, and it's that area which Tessa is going to focus on. So, enough from me. Over to you, Tessa.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming on a rainy, cold night. If you think I'm about to talk about tits and arse and undercover journalism, I'm really sorry to disappoint you, but you're wrong. We can save that for the Q&A though. Sorry. I'm here to talk about what I'm calling transparency wars, the kind of cult of transparency throwing a new light on issues of celebrity culture and privacy in journalism. I'm really looking at the nature of what is the purpose of journalism in an ever-changing, high-tech global age, with all these new cultural and political forces going on. Now, to start off with, I've written a lot about this area, and over the years, there have been three main issues that have come up time and time again. The first one is that everyone involved in the area of sort of privacy legislation and whether journalists should invade privacy or not, all seem to have very different expectations of what their privacy should involve, and all seem to have different definitions of what privacy means. I'll give you an example. Back in 2002, it was one of the major cases involving journalists, celebrities, and privacy law. It involved the supermodel Naomi Campbell and her case against the Mirror newspaper. Basically, what had happened is that they had decided to show that when she said she didn't take drugs, unlike other models, that she was lying. So off they went, and they secretly photographed her coming out of a drug rehabilitation centre and wrote some details about her private medical condition. She actually won the first case. So in the first case, the judge ruled in her favour, and she won actually quite a small amount of damages, which showed that maybe he wasn't quite sure that it was such a big deal. She won £3,500. And it did set up a precedent, the idea that under the law of confidence, secret photography in a public place can be illegal. But as I was making the point, people have different ideas, and the Mirror went to appeal and won, because the second judge in the Court of Appeal ruled in favour of press freedom. So that, as you can imagine, has confused a lot of journalists, that even the judges rule very differently on the same case. The second major issue that's come up over the years on this is that some people say privacy is completely dead. It's gone now. I remember a time before the internet when the idea of sort of volunteering your private information was sort of a bit odd. It would be like showing someone your secret diary in your drawer. Whereas today, lots of people volunteer kind of diary stuff on Facebook, on YouTube, and all the rest of it. Now, it does seem that privacy is completely dead. I mean, recently in the news, Google was accused very strongly of snatching data from people's computers as its Street View car drove by. And we're talking about people's private emails, private passwords, and their URLs. This is serious invasion of privacy. And the fact they seem to have got away with it does beg a question about how much privacy protection we have simply as citizens, never mind as being journalists trying to invade people's privacy for the public interest, but we're talking about companies invading all of our privacy. They could get access then to our private sources, our notes on stories that we're keeping confidential until they're good enough to run. So there is a sort of a tension in societies now, I think, where big companies are invading people's privacy and the governments are trying to keep up, and there's a big debate. And certainly here, I think there's a real questioning of Google's cult of information gathering regardless of individuals' rights. And what's interesting for me is that over the years, the big debate was about journalists invading people's privacy, and not much said about big companies at all. Whereas now, more is said of big companies, and I think that's quite welcome, because it always seemed for a long time that it was just journalists that do the invading. But we're invading for a very particular purpose, not just to make money, not just to keep the information secret, but the journalist's raison d'etre is to make things public. And when you make your story public, you're basically offering it up to everyone else for judgment. Do you think my story is good enough? Do you think because I invaded X's privacy and I got this story that it was worthwhile? Is it in the public interest? The third major thing over the years that's often come up is the quite peculiar thing in some ways. It's not always these issues about the state invading individuals' privacy, but actually it's where citizens are invading other citizens' privacy, or even their own, sort of invading their own privacy, kind of self-invasion. So when people do put private video clips on YouTube, when people do start filming unannounced people's private, say, party habits on their mobile phones, you know, it used to be journalists that did that kind of thing. Now it's sort of the whole culture of people filming each other privately and surreptitiously, and not all of it is welcome. And there are starting to be cases in America, actually, where students have filmed other students' drunken antics, and they're starting to take other students to court because there still has to be a sort of certain area, like your bedroom, which is considered private, even if the public street is not. So those are the three main issues that have come up time and time again. And what now? Well, now I'd argue that these sort of issues are becoming even more complex and need even more debate. And I'm going to go through some key areas where that's true and look at where do journalists fit into these amazingly complex, high-tech, ethical, privacy-invading issues. So there are three new areas which we all have to consider in this kind of high-tech modern age. So number one, we have a society today where we have someone called the Information Commissioner who's deliberating what citizens' privacy should mean. And then we have something called the Press Complaints Commission that is working out the same in relation to journalists. So that's been going on for quite a while now. But what's happening today is journalists are exposing other journalists' invasions of privacy. That hasn't happened in such an intense way until recently. I'm talking, of course, about the case involving the News of the World's royal reporter Clive Goodwin, who was discovered by the police to have been tapping or hacking into the phone messages of 3 members of the royal household. And he was imprisoned. He was jailed for that. It was considered there wasn't enough public interest, presumably in what he'd found out, to justify that extreme invasion of privacy. Then what happened is that the editor of the News of the World at the time, Andy Coulson, said he didn't know of any of this. He then resigned and became the communications advisor to David Cameron, the now Prime Minister. Then the Guardian journalists began to investigate and presented further evidence to the police about the News of the World journalist activities and tried to get them to reopen the case. And the big question I have of all of this is, how far should other journalists expose each other in the name of transparency and outrage at what other journalists are doing? And it's an important question, and it doesn't get asked enough. Now journalists think other journalists are fair game, eating each other alive, undermining each other, questioning each other. Now, it all sounds really, really good, but is it? It wasn't so long ago that there was kind of despite the competition between rival medias, there was an unofficial code of the idea that the journalists, the press, TV journalists, they defend each other because there's something worth fighting for in terms of the principle of press freedom generally in this country, in the name of democracy, to make powerful people hold them to account and to scrutinise things that most ordinary people don't have time or the resources to do. That's what journalists did. That was their absolute fundamental role. But now, over the years, what's been happening is that universal ideal has slowly been chipped away since ever I became a journalist. It just chipped away more and more and more. One of the first issues where it got chipped away, where journalists started sort of attacking each other in public and undermining each other and all the rest of it in such a public way, was when Diana died, and there was a big debate about which kind of journalists, which kind of photographers had hunted her down, that had maybe somehow caused her death, or sort of the culture which led to her death, versus all the sort of broadsheets, high and mighty newspapers that wouldn't do that kind of thing, wouldn't employ paparazzis, wouldn't be interested in the royal's private life. And that was really the divide between mainly the tabloid types of journalists and photographers versus all the other more noble ones, apparently. And it disturbed me at the time because there was something, as I said, universal and important to defend about the rights of journalists and photojournalists to inform people about what's going on, and in that we should stick together. But suddenly there was a divide. The second more up-to-date example of that is now this case, which is setting journalists apart again between those that engage in breaking the law to get stories and those who apparently or absolutely don't. So now you have journalists accusing journalists at the News of the World and saying, oh, well, they committed offences. And those very same people who are accusing the News of the World journalists come from rival organisations who have also been seen and noted to have used the services of a certain Benjamin Pell. Now, Benjamin Pell was a famous source for many journalists across the whole board of newspapers, not just the tabloids, the broadsheets as well. And he famously would steal information from lawyers' bins about their celebrity clients. So when you saw a big splash and you thought, gosh, there's so much detailed information about lawyers' accounts and a case that certain celebrities involved in, well, a lot of it came from a guy wandering around at night picking stuff out of bins around Fleet Street and Theobald's Road. So there's a lot of hypocrisy on this story, and it raises a question, obviously, should journalists ever break the law? Is there ever a defence? And I would argue, yes, there is a defence. You make your own judgment about whether you do it, but there can be a defence. And in fact, that defence, where you break the law and you say it's in the public interest and you can prove it and you can defend it, is actually recognised in British law. And it's an age-old principle that there is something special about what journalists do. We may not like certain personalities, we may not like certain stories they do, but there is something special in a democracy about what they do for the public, in the public's interest. It's debatable, of course, but nevertheless it's something special, and it's something that even the law recognises to this day, even if other people don't. Now, the second major new area that needs more consideration is a culture of transparency. I don't know if you read a lot of public policy documents, but there's always councils or government departments banging on about transparency this, transparency that, always making a virtue of being transparent. We're letting it all out, and it's heavily promoted, definitely by the last government and continuing with the present one. The idea that the state should at least show more of its workings, its confidential briefings, its deliberations. One of the ultimate calls for transparency was, of course, Tony Blair's releasing of the famous dossier on weapons of mass destruction that justifies in part the reason why he went to war. Now, this culture of transparency and let it all out seems really good for journalists because, well, you can just sit there, wait for a government department to be all transparent, pick off the documents and write your story. You don't have to investigate anything. I mean, it sounds really easy. And a lot of journalists have celebrated the culture of transparency. Alongside this culture, there's been the introduction of a Freedom of Information Act, where you can apply, ask a question, ask for a certain document, and under the Freedom of Information Act, you hopefully get that, and you write your story. So, hey, why investigate very much? You just have to wait for the culture of transparency to release stuff, or you can just apply to the Act and you've got your story. Well, I think there is quite too much applauding, I think, within journalism about these two major new strands, the transparency and the freedom of information. And I'll say why. It's not because I don't want more information out there in the public domain. No, of course, we should all, as citizens of this country, know what's going on rather than not know. That's all to be assumed. But the trouble with being a journalist and thinking what the role of a journalist is with all this is that, firstly, there's no guarantee that the government will release the document in a sort of transparency call. It might keep some back. We don't know. We only know what they do reveal. And the second thing is it kind of gives a sort of reliance, a sort of laziness in journalism to rely on applying for a Freedom of Information Act way of getting certain documents, rather than being more active in the process of being a journalist, which is checking those documents with sources, which is trying to find out the source of documents that aren't shown, that we don't know about, that maybe someone else does know about. That sort of active relationship with the public, in fact, rather than just relying on the state to somehow do the investigation for us. And I would argue that we do need to promote a more active sense of being an investigative journalist. The other aspect of this is there's something quite dangerous, I think. While the state promotes a sense of transparency, that it is being transparent, look here, being transparent, here's my Acts of Parliament, here's the things it was based on, it's justifying a culture that we all should be transparent, that we all should reveal private information to the state more and more, because, hey, we're all apparently involved in a culture of transparency, aren't we? We're all supposed to buy into it. I'll give you two examples that are very, very disturbing. Today, ministers, apparently, according to a newspaper report, are seeking access to the bank details of virtually everyone in this country. They're justifying it by saying they want to crack down on billions of pounds worth of fraud and error in the welfare system, and that it will help the Inland Revenue, the tax authorities. That is a very serious leap from having private bank details that we have confidentiality over, to suddenly the idea of the state having immediate access to those things. Normally, when the state, the tax authorities do have access to your bank accounts, by the way, it's normally when they're investigating you. Other times, you send off your tax return, they're checked, and that's the end of it. That is a serious leap forward in privacy invasion. The second thing, and this really does affect, in particular, journalists, I don't know how many of you know this, but I looked at the website of the Information Commissioner's Office, and there's a section called Data Controllers. Now, it used to be that data controllers were people like computer companies, people who would amass data, or sort of state departments or something. Well, no, now we're all data controllers if you work in the media and amass data. In fact, if you don't comply, and there's certain limitations on this, but if you don't comply, it's a criminal offence. So I looked up who was actually complying, and one of the newspapers has complied, the Mirror Group, Trinity Mirror, Midlands. And they've had to fill in 11 pages to satisfy and not to be criminally liable. 11 pages of information about why they gathered data and on who. Most of it is about members of the public. Well, that's not surprising. They're a newspaper. I think we knew that. So it's nothing special to record what they do. And it's quite interesting to know, I suppose, the fact that the Mirror Group have CCTV cameras that also record sound, apparently, but that's just to protect their buildings. It's nothing to do with anything else. And you think, what is the purpose of this kind of excessive bureaucracy? What is the purpose? And in some ways, at such a general level, there's nothing really to know in this. It's a completely useless document. I mean, I think we know that newspapers gather information. There's nothing new. So what is going on? Why does the state want to do that, and over journalists? Well, I would argue that they're doing it simply to exert a kind of principle of monitoring over journalists and free speech. This hasn't, as far as I know, led to any censorship because of invasion of privacy, but it does set out the principle that the state has the upper hand, and we should all be worried about that. Because if we are to have free speech and exchange of information in this country, we need less of this bureaucracy and monitoring, and we need actually more freedom to converse with each other and deliver stories. Now, my final thing is something probably a lot of you have been preoccupied with, because it's been all over the news, which is WikiLeaks. The culture of leaking and leaking and leaking. Again, you know, seems quite a really good thing for journalists. You sit back, you wait for the WikiLeaks, you write your story, you sit back again, you wait for the WikiLeaks. They released 92,000 documents on Afghanistan. That's a lot of stories to write. It's a lot of documents to look through. Looks really, really good. In fact, it's so good that another sheet, this is a copy of an email that's doing the rounds amongst investigative journalists of journalists from 39 countries around the world in support of WikiLeaks. Journalists from Norway, Cameroon, Denmark, Mexico, America, Croatia, Chile, the list goes on. So there's a credible amount of support. Even though, funnily enough, the founder of WikiLeaks doesn't claim to be part of the media at all. But anyway, the journalists are celebrating the fact that they've got access to sources which can be the basis of their stories. But I'd say the first thing about this, which is actually WikiLeaks is no contribution to journalism in itself. And that's because journalism is never just about presenting a kind of tsunami of information and then walking away from that and just sort of leaving it there. It's never been about that, and it never will be. Journalism is a different thing. It's about processing that information. It's about analysing it. It's about testing it. Maybe it's not true, or maybe there's a reason why it was leaked in the first place. It's about explaining the world and looking for the truth, not just shoving a whole load of random documents. That is not, in itself, journalism. What there is in this case is, of course, a leak. He has a scoop, but he hasn't turned the leak into journalism. He's just done half the job. But to his defence, he doesn't claim to be part of the media, so that's not what he's doing. But a lot of journalists are seeing what he's doing as a journalistic endeavour, but it is not. Now, in his defence, and to be fair to the founder of WikiLeaks, he's criticised heavily for putting people in danger. And I think the whole debate about that really depends on your view of the war. If you're against the war like I have been, you might argue then, as I do, that in fact it is the war putting people at danger and the British troops shouldn't be there in the first place. But this has caused a huge worldwide debate, as you all know, and I think the leaking fundamentally reveals a very important point about the war. And that is that the inner ranks of the military fighting that war, amongst them there is a huge amount of disquiet, which is why the biggest leaks and stories about the war have been coming from military personnel themselves. It hasn't come from journalists just investigating, but they've been handed these stories on a plate. Another example is, of course, the photographs of the abuse at Abu Ghraib. No journalist found that story. It was simply given to them and leaked. So it does beg a question, these WikiLeaks and the culture of leaking. What is the role of the journalist and all that? And it is certainly not just to say that is journalism. It is certainly to say that we do something more than that in the face of a culture of leaks. So in our world, in our new ever-changing world, where all these new things are going on, I think it really is important more than ever to think about what is the role of the journalist. People argue that possibly we're redundant because so many people write blogs. Well, that's absolutely rubbish. We have such an important task, and that is to do what a lot of people are not doing, which is scrutinising and questioning what is going on and what is presented out there all the time on the internet and in the media and in public places and public policy documents and so forth. So our role is, first of all, to find out the truth. Secondly, to work hard at getting more details about the world, not just relying on state organisations to be transparent. That would be a complete mistake. And thirdly, to consider whether the information you've got, even if it's just handed to you on a plate or just leaked to you accidentally, 92,000 documents, is it actually something you want to publish? Is it actually something interesting or new there, even though there's a lot of it? It's to question it, basically. And I think that's how I'll leave you, is keep questioning as journalists, because there's a lot of stuff out there that still needs a lot of questioning. Thank you.
Well, Tessa, thanks for that. Brilliantly presented, very controversial. I think I probably agree with 20% of that, and disagree very strongly with 80%, but it's over to you now. Please. We're going to move slowly across the audience because we have, unfortunately, just one mic. I should congratulate the Linc team. This has been streamed live, would you believe, at this very moment. You could have stayed at home and watched it on the internet. But depending on which side we start, it will gradually move across. Because rather than move around this mic, it needs to be sort of carried across gradually. So who's got the first comment or question? Yes? Here, so we'll move across that. Say who you are on there.
Darren Moss, third year journalism student. Do you ever have to consider whether compromising your own safety is in the interest of getting a story?
Yes. Well, I think that we all have to make our individual decisions. I mean, when you're working on big projects with a big team, you might get some help with bodyguards, you might work with another journalist, and in that sense you're not alone. But for a lot of people these days, they are working solo or just with one others because of the cheapening of the technology and small teams, and more people can do this kind of work. So I think really the best advice I can give is you have to trust your own judgment and really do the research first and the homework, and even talk to someone else who's been in that situation, especially if it's something like going to war. There are also courses about war reporting on health and safety. So that's what I'd say, is really trust your own judgment. And in the end, journalists, some of them do take massive risks. And they weigh that up themselves, and sometimes it works and sometimes they get kidnapped. I mean, that extreme example, or even killed. So, you know, sometimes it's a very serious issue for people to consider. So I think you have to trust your own judgment and definitely do your homework on it.
You had to consider it because you've worn body armour, haven't you, on one assignment? So
yes.
Maybe tell, what was that involving?
I did a story investigating knife crime, and I was asked to wear a body armour because in case I got knifed, but actually I think it was also because the programme makers didn't want to get sued in case I did. They were more scared than me, actually, and I think it just sort of shows you've got to make your own judgments, what you feel comfortable in. there's certain situations, there's no way I would go into them, they'd be far too scary. In other situations I feel quite calm, and I kind of judge it on the basis of, well, if something happens, can I run away? Is there enough time? And if I can't, I don't do it.
Right, the runaway principle, remember that. Right, yes, and then we'll gradually move this way.
Mark Barry, MA Journalism. You mentioned journalists investigating journalism. Do you think the reason that that's happened more often is because basically journalism has become quite interested amongst the public? Journalists are sort of considered an untrustworthy part of society amongst the public, and the only way we can sort of criticise other sections of society is if we actually shine a light on the industry ourselves, rather than just ignore the problems within the industry.
Yes, I think that's a very good question. That's often the reason that's given for journalists who are doing stories on other journalists. We have to restore public confidence. But I would say that what's been happening is that the whole sort of support by some journalists to interrogate the works of others has led to an emerging climate in support of state control over the whole of journalism. Now that's a very worrying thing, because that means all of our works are affected. And, you know, there are those that argue, well, you know, that's the price we have to pay in order to keep bad journalists out of the profession. But I would say that it's not for other journalists to judge that, it's for the public to judge that. If they don't like what certain journalists do, they will make their voices heard, and they normally do, in the form of letter writing and so forth, or writing on their own websites, and getting a sort of, you know, Twitter campaign against certain journalists. And you know, there is a lot of pressure amongst journalists because of that, you know, and rightly so. So I think that it's a wrong-headed, it sounds good in principle, but it's wrong-headed. It leads down the road of state control. And I think ultimately it should be the public that judge us, and not the state.
Okay, thank you. Anyone here? No? Question, comment? No, it's all gone quiet. Anyone here? Yes. Can the mic?
Just one Republic.
Excellent.
Following the Watergate scandal in the 1970s, which effectively, I think, two journalists on Washington Post...
Bit louder.
Sorry. Following the Watergate scandal of the 1970s, where two journalists on Washington Post effectively ended the presidency of Richard Nixon, who now avoided impeachment, I have read that more radical journals in the States were increasingly bought out by right-wing sympathisers and interests, and much more stringent editorial control was exercised. Do you care to comment on that sort of scenario?
So you're saying that editorials were controlled after a scoop was had? I don't know about that, but I think that sometimes editorial controls are brought in because sometimes the methods of journalism, even if it is to get a scoop, are seen as problematic, too expensive, out of control, and so forth. There's many, many reasons. It does seem contradictory, doesn't it, though, for, you know, a newspaper with lots of scoops to, you know, suddenly do that. I don't know the details of that, but insofar as it happens in this country, normally it's because of methods or costs of getting that scoop, which is a shame, because you'd think scoops would lead to more scoops and they'd be more encouraging. But we live in we live in a global recession. So unfortunately that can dictate a lot of things like that, an editorial policy. But we also live in one where there is a kind of tug of war about how far journalists can go and how far they can't, and that's what I was trying to emphasise, really, is that we have to fight for the role of the journalist in a democracy, even more so now, especially with all these complex new issues turning up. It's really, really important, I think.
certainly in response to that, CIA penetration of the media, mainstream and alternative, certainly expanded after Watergate. That's been documented. Okay. Anyone from here? As the mic moves? Anyone from over here? No? Okay. Anyone from here? Right. Comment, question. Anyone? No? Yes.
Steve Berry, first year journalism. Would you say you've ever gone too far morally to get a story, or been asked to go too far to get a story?
Thank you.
That's a very good question. There was a lot of disquiet in the last few years because of the whole obsession with celebrity stories and their private lives. There arose then an issue of, well, how did journalists get those stories? Because aside from people like Benjamin Pell, who stole from dustbins and then he was found out, the stories kept coming, you know, so to speak, about people's sex lives and about them dressing up in soldiers' uniforms in dungeons and being senior members of the Grand Prix team. So, you know, what was all that about? And certainly journalists I've spoken to have met female journalists who've basically slept with people or taken a lot of drugs to get those stories, and that was causing concern because why were they doing that? Maybe for fun, okay. But it wasn't just that. There was a lot of pressure in newsrooms over the last few years, less so now, but in the last few years, to get those kind of stories, to get those scoops, because that was in demand. It was like almost the height of celebrity culture on private exposés of sex scandals. I don't do those sort of stories, and you know, to me that's not particularly interesting anyway. I think that the real issue for me is having met a lot of war reporters who have risked their lives, actually. I don't know if I'd do that. I've got family. I don't know if I'd do that. I'd still be very, very careful. You know, it would take, I think, for most journalists, the most serious story in the world to go that far. But the trouble is there's pressure. There's also a sort of confidence you get by being in a dangerous situation for a while. And you think, I can handle this. This is going to be okay. This is going to be okay. And you make judgments. So I think everyone has to make it for themselves. But there is always pressure from people you work for to either go the extra mile or in some cases not go there at all. And I think you have to argue and be very robust these days because there's lots of competition for jobs, and people fight for those jobs and are prepared to do all kinds of risky things. But I think you have to keep your own integrity. I think it's really important. Otherwise you kind of lose yourself in a sort of amoral vacuum, and then what's true and what's not, it's no good, you know. You have to kind of have a sense of what you think is a rational, good decision and what isn't, you know. Yeah, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yes, microphone.
Hi there, I'm Christine Digby, Level 2 journalist and LSJTV. Richard pointed out that it's a fairly male-dominated area of the media with investigative journalism. Have you ever found that being a female affects the stereotype of the roughy-toughy men go out and get type of scooping?
I'm quite tough myself, actually. I think everyone is different. I've met some very delicate, kind of less macho guys doing stories, all sorts, you know. I think in terms of being able to do any job like this, you kind of play to your strengths, you know. There's certain situations I wouldn't go into because I wouldn't feel confident physically, and there's other things that don't demand any kind of physical strength. It just demands from anyone, whatever sex they are, to be clever, lucky, think laterally about a situation, about a document, about the evidence. And I think it's becoming far more equal now. I mean, really, so many people now have cameras, they're going out shooting their own documentary investigations. investigating, writing their blogs. You know, it's open to everybody now. You know, and you know, you're as good as your work. Really. Yeah.
Okay, I'll ask you about WikiLeaks. A lot of journalism relies on leaks, doesn't it? Watergate, to name but one. It's a conventional way in which investigative journalism works. Someone within the establishment feels aggrieved and they leak it, don't they? What mainstream journalists did was to synthesize that information. They made sense of it, didn't they? Isn't that an important function? So, who was it? It was the Washington Post, the Guardian, Dispatches, Channel 4, etc. Weren't they doing conventional journalism? And what interests me about WikiLeaks is that there was a highly selective process that they had to go in to select what we knew about. And what we know about, you know, these special squads in the American forces which go and assassinate Taliban suspects. For instance, the fact that they've always said that they had no time for counting bodies, but now we know that they've been doing it. There must be loads of other stuff. Isn't that the kind of focus you need on WikiLeaks? Not to actually, as it were, critique journalists for accepting another leak.
That's not what I was critiquing. I was agreeing with you, actually.
Okay.
Which is that, of course, journalists have relied on people that leak. But if we don't distinguish between the people that leak and the journalism and the journalists that process that, we're actually blurring two activities. And that's come up in law and in cases. So, for example, there have been cases where a photographer has gone in famously to the Catherine Zeta-Jones wedding and taken secret photographs. Now, he got in and invaded the privacy. He broke the rules in that hotel. All right? He did that. The second stage in the process was that those photographs were published, I can't remember, in one of the magazines. Now, the question was, who was doing what? Who was being a journalist and who wasn't? Who was sort of breaking and entering and who wasn't? Who was doing the publication? And you have to distinguish, because in law, when that case came up, not only the person that had broken and entered was sort of had up for doing that, but so was the magazine. But the magazine didn't do the breaking and entering. The magazine simply published. It was doing the journalism. It processed, it analysed, it wrote the story, and it published. It disseminated to all of us. So I think it's really important that the two acts are separated, partly because in law they're treated the same. And so what's happening is that freedom of speech and expression is being censored as if we as journalists are as complicit as someone who leaked, broke confidentiality, or invaded an organisation as privacy, as if we were the same, and we're not, unless we happen to break and enter as well, but that's a different issue. But insofar as we process, analyse, publish, no, we're not. We're doing the work of the journalist. We're not doing the leaking and the betraying of a confidence, for example, of an employer or something. So we have to distinguish. It's just very, very important to really give that. At the moment, no one's really making that point, and they should do, because the judges get away with stopping what we do by associating us as if we're doing the same act as someone breaking and entering and breaking the confidence of an employer or something. And we're not. We're doing something very different.
Hi, my name is Viola. I'm a PhD journalism student. I have a question towards you, sort of, I don't know, moral guideline perhaps, or some sort of, boundary between what's journalism, what's not journalism, in terms of celebrity journalism, because I find it very hard. I'm coughing. I find it very hard to see it as journalism when Hello, OK, or whatever publishes photos of Catherine Zeta-Jones eating cake. I find it, might be an invasion of privacy or not, which is to me also a question if I sell pictures of myself doing that and then, get kind of annoyed when other people also make money from it. But is that journalism? I can understand why Naomi Campbell, you know, saying sort of, look at me, I'm a role model, I don't take drugs, you know, taking pictures of that might be journalism. I mean, where's the borderline? Where's the, you know, where's the moral guideline? Where does journalism stop and, you know?
Gossip.
Yeah, gossip.
It's always been gossip.
There is none. I mean, journalism isn't about deciding it's certain subjects and not others. Journalism is an approach to all aspects of life. And insofar as humans do all kinds of crazy stuff, and serious stuff, and important stuff, and personal stuff, we can all process that and write about it, analyse it. So, you know, some people might read, you know, diary journalism, celebrity journalism, and other people might read, you know, news about the law courts or something. The point is, it's the approach to our world. That's what journalists give, in search of the truth about our world and the processing and the analysing, the gathering the facts, not the subject matter. That's what I think is important, because there are those that argue, oh, certain types of things journalism write about is somehow non-journalistic. Well, you know, if it's trying to search for the truth about something or analyse, it's journalism. You might not like it, you might call it bad journalism, fair enough, but yeah, it's still done by a journalist.
Richard Orange, one of the tutors. Richard said that he agreed with you 20% of what you said. I'll up that a bit, I'll go to 35. Okay. One of the issues that bothered me, or I was interested in, is when you suggested that it's okay or acceptable for a journalist to break the law knowingly. So I'm not going to cover that directly, but I'll say this. How many editors or publishers or station managers or media lawyers would endorse that and say so in court? Or are you on your own if you do?
I think it depends. Some laws are so bad, people are breaking them anyway, and a journalist might break it because they're proving a point that there's a culture of breaking it because the nature of the law is bad. You know, I think we have to think not, let's write a story about everything that's legal. Well, why do we leave out the area of criminal justice then, and the laws are somehow beyond scrutiny? You know, the last government brought in so many laws, an unprecedented 3,000 laws or something. All of them are good? Come on. I think there needs to be more scrutiny of actual laws, especially some of the newer ones. And actually, interestingly, the current government is starting to question whether some of the laws should be just repealed and chucked out, because they are criminalising so many areas of life. It's a wonder we can all sort of breathe and get on with our lives. So, yes, certainly there is a valid justification, but, you know, open to public scrutiny and debate about certain laws that just shouldn't be there, or wrong, or are causing extreme hardship to people. And that needs to be exposed, even in a court of law. Some things are just willing to go to court for. They're willing to, you know, I think good journalists in that sense should take more risks in those areas, definitely. So, no, laws should not be above scrutiny. And nor should journalists, by the way. They're not above the law either.
Hi, Ola Omiyemi, I'm a tutor here. I normally tell my students that stories are not neutral. Okay, it's about somebody and they do have consequences. Yeah? Can you tell us what ethical issue that you've encountered, and how did you resolve that, and were there any consequences, either positive or negative?
I don't know if I'd agree with you that every story is subjective, because I think one of the...
No story is neutral. I didn't say subjective.
Yes. No, yes, you're saying that every story is subjective, but I don't think
No.
Well, if it's not neutral, then it's partial.
No, it's about somebody, because we are not writing in a vacuum. We are writing about people. So that story will affect somebody positively or negatively.
So what do you mean by neutral then?
That is that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. You know, we journalists, we write about people, not about any other thing. It's about people. If you write about me, I could, you know, react to it in two ways. Either I celebrate, I say, that's wonderful, or I go into and say, oh God, this is terrible. So, so it's not neutral. You may feel happy that you've done it, but to me, the story is about me and how people feel about me, isn't it?
But I'd slightly disagree. I think stories can be objective and neutral. You know, I think the reporter, one of the key jobs that they can do is not get sucked into an emotional response about what they're saying, but actually stand back, because not many people do this, and one of the roles of the journalist is to do this, and to analyse things and give them a certain understanding from what they have seen, what they have gathered, and so forth. Objectivity doesn't mean you ignore the fact it's about human beings, the story. Objectivity means you simply take a stand back and question your own assumptions about something, question your own judgment, and think, you know, I have got this evidence, but hold it, who gave it to me? I was that guy over there, and I've seen him in the bar with that soldier and military major. So that means maybe the army leaked that to me. It wasn't just an accidental thing by a stranger. You know, these kind of things the journalists can only do if they stand back from their immediate impressions and immediate receiving of information. That's being more analytical, more objective, and trying to be neutral in the face of interest groups that are constantly fighting for your attention and trying to sway you. More important, especially in news, I think, because you want to tell the public the facts and what you understand by the facts, not just be spoon-fed by one interest group over another or something. That's how I look at it, and I really think that's important, because too often, I think, in journalism courses, the sort of idea that we're all subjective and just sort of react to things and it's all about humans is the governing kind of thing to teach. And we've kind of lost, I think, in the teaching, the role that journalists have in standing back and looking at things in an analytical way, actually. Yeah.
I think, Tessa, your investigation of the Scientology movement would be a good example for them to hear about, the way in which you covered that and the thought processes you went through.
Yes, I spent 3 months on and off at the Celebrity Centre that's run by the Church of Scientology. The Spectator magazine asked me to explore the religion, because so much negative press had been written about them, and really they were quite demonised, and I thought it was quite interesting to see who they actually were and why they appear to be so, I suppose, concentrated in their beliefs and have such bad press. So I did what is a sort of, I guess, a classic journalistic device, which is to go along to somewhere, pretending to be someone else, just to see how they react to what they think is a member of the public, rather than to announce I was a journalist, in which case they might react differently. And just to see how they are with general members of the public for a few months. And what was really interesting was that, yes, they do have senses of humour, you know, they're not robots, they are actually human beings, and they have an incredibly strong belief, as you might imagine, in what they think. And what I discovered as well through reading some of their literature, that the way they sort of appear quite very intensely and very keen to sell you their literature is what most journalists who are critical of them have written, saying, well, it's just about gathering money. Well, it's also because they are so keen to teach what they believe in for the whole world, and that's because it comes from their belief that artists and creative people should be the leaders of the world, because their emotions, any sort of negative emotion you have, can be released in happiness by being entertained by actors and musicians. And their strong belief is if you get rid of your negative emotions, then you know, you'll be happy and the world will be happier. So you know, I found that basically they weren't robots. You know, there's no reason to demonise them. And insofar as there's evidence against the organisation, because there have been cases in France and Germany, you know, those stand the test of time and the test of the law courts. But insofar as an ordinary person meets those kind of people, they are who they are, very enthusiastic members of a group that wants you to join them. And I didn't find anything particularly odd in that. It was completely justifiable, you know.
You did get an angle. What was it?
Yes, my sort of angle and scoop on it was that they are expanding into and want to expand by moving premises to be near RADA, which is the training ground of all the young actors in this country, one of them, because that's their thing. They think that actors and musicians hold the key to making us all happy. And that's kind of it. I mean, it's not actually very complicated, and they have a certain therapeutic modern approach to society, and they think the talking cure, just by talking out your problems and being around people that make you happy, will liberate us all, apparently.
And another of your big investigations was when you were a madam of a brothel, right? I think they might be interested to hear about that.
It's not glamorous, I'll tell you that much. Yes, that came about because Channel 4 wanted me to investigate the issue of trafficked women into this country from Eastern Europe. Women who have paid a lot of money to people to get them illegally into this country and have to pay off their debts. So I decided that often these kinds of programs had been about looking at one pimp or one woman, or always singular. And my approach was to go to as many brothels as possible in London and kind of do like a mini survey.
Roughly
of
how many?
I went to 10, I worked in 10 around the whole of London, so that I could make a kind of interesting claim, like, you know, out of 10 brothels I found that 8 had Eastern European women in them, or things like that, because so much of the coverage had all been about one odd person, and what can you say about that? Oh, that person is good and bad or whatever, but to actually have a sense of the industry itself was actually, I think, quite important, because there was lots of hype about the influx of immigrants, or the dangers for these women, or there were slaves, all these things, and I was trying to find out what the truth was behind the headlines, essentially. So it involved several months of working as a madame, which I'm quite good at, apparently. I basically increased the sales at the brothels by threefold, and
you had to have a kind of accent, didn't you, and whatever.
Well, yes. When people,
was it Essex?
I was taught by a really lovely woman, actually, who had worked in Soho for a long time, and she had a very saleswoman kind of voice, and so I just sort of adopted the voice because she taught me, and I thought that was the way to do it.
For us?
I'm not an actress, but I think the main thing is to say that it was so saleswoman, like when you walk into a hotel and you're meted and greeted. I was like that, and I don't think many madames are necessarily like that. Mm. So lots of people kept coming to the premises. So I increased the takings. In fact, I earned more than journalism that week. Don't know what that says, but yeah, there was certainly as well, you know, highs and lows. There was, you know, there were some laughs in what was, you know, terrible thing to look at and experience, and for those women to tell me about, but we also had some laughs, and you know, it's good to show all this, I think, in films, to show that not everything is 100% bleak, that human life is full of greys, not just black and white or good and evil. It's full of greys, full of grey areas.
I think we've come to an end, folks. We got finishing on a really fascinating area. I know you're all now desperate to ask Tessa about what it's like being a madam in a brothel. She's got a few minutes before she dashes off to the train, but we've had a terrifically interesting talk, haven't we, folks? So let's thank Tessa.
Thank you.